Hey, what's up guys? Timothy here. Bringing you another deck tech. I know not a lot of people watch these videos, but I've been tinkering around with a bunch of ideas lately for Standard. I think Standard is pretty diverse right now, and we just got out of the Pro Tour, so we'll see how the Pro Tour shook things up. There were a lot of really neat Delirium decks and Emerge decks and so on and so forth. And Black-White actually took home the trophy, but I have a brew here for a Red-White human equipment-based deck. I call it the Armored Humans deck, haha. And I know a lot of people have probably done tinkering around with this idea as well, but I think that the cards are definitely there for a competitive deck. And as we'll see, this is actually a pretty budget deck too, so it's a pretty nice option for game day or just someone trying to casually get into the game without spending a lot of money. Now, why should you be playing a deck like this? Well, it is an aggro deck, so if that's your style, then this will fit with you very nicely. Really, the only aggro deck in Standard at the moment that I would honestly say is an actual aggro deck is Vampires, and that didn't have a very good showing at the Pro Tour at all. So I wouldn't expect to see it on the competitive scene, but just based on the local game stores I've been to, people really like Vampire decks, so it is a good aggro option. This is a good alternative if you don't want to play a Vampire deck. This deck has some very explosive draws where you can start jamming in tons of damage very early on, and it is extremely low curve. You'll see in just a second. It curves out at 3, so we don't have anything in the deck that costs more than 3 mana to play. Plus we get to cheat some spells into and cheat on mana costs a little bit, which is pretty nice. Anyway, to the deck, we're going to go over the cards individually, but here's a snapshot of what the deck looks like. There are 39 non-land cards in the deck, 21 lands. I'll go over the lands in a second, but it's pretty simple. 39 seems like a high number. You could go up to 22 lands. Maybe 23 would be pushing it for a deck like this, but since we curve at 3 and we already get to cheat on the costs for a couple cards, I think 21 lands is fine for the deck, but I don't think 20 or 22 would be a significant difference. Anyway, you'll see it is an equipment-based deck. There is a huge equipment package that takes up about 10 cards from the deck, plus a couple other supporters. We're going to go over individual card choices, starting with what may be the only, not the only new, but one of the newest cards on this list, Sigarda's Aid. This is an absolutely incredible card in a deck that is built to abuse it. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually do anything in multiples, so there's only 2 of them in the deck, since drawing the multiple ones isn't great and we don't really have a way to cycle through them. There are 2 in the deck, and in case you don't know what it does, it lets you basically flash in auras and equipments, but what's even more relevant for this deck is whenever an equipment enters our side of the battlefield, we can attach it to a creature for free. And mind you, we can do that at instant speed since we can flash our equipment in. We're playing 8 equipment, and in this deck they give pretty significant boosts, so we can really surprise our opponent's attackers by making our creatures huge, or we can even get around removal spells like Galvanic Bombardment or Fiery Impulse. Even Grasp of Darkness can be fizzled by flashing in the right equipment at the right time. Like I said, it doesn't do anything in multiples, so we are down to 2, but I could see going a lot heavier on the aura/equipment theme here and playing a couple more rather than some of the other themes I've incorporated into the deck. Go over the 2 pieces of equipment that are in the main board here. Stoneforge Masterwork is really nice simply because it's cheap. You'll notice with the distribution of the deck, it's a little awkward, and I'll talk about this again when I get to Thalia's Lieutenant, that some of the creatures don't actually share card types, but some of the creatures have enough card types on them that you're usually going to get a pretty big boost off of that. Now, what I mean by this is consider Stonehaven Outfitter or Stoneforge Acolyte. They're not actually human creatures, they're core, but they do also have that ally type line, so they work in conjunction with Bushwacker and Weapons Trainer. They work with each other. I believe Stonehaven Outfitter is a soldier, so it works with the other soldiers in the deck, like Thalia's Lieutenant, so on and so forth. Actually, it might not be. It might be an Artificer instead. But even though every creature type in the deck doesn't necessarily share a creature type, Stoneforge Masterwork will work in such a way that most creatures will share with at least 1 or 2 other creatures that you have on board, with humans being the biggest represented here. Even Reckless Bushwacker is a goblin, but it's also an ally, so it works with Acolytes, it works with Weapons Trainer, Stonehaven Outfitter. There are a lot of options for Stoneforge Masterwork to give you a really, really big boost. Not to mention it's synergy with Handwear Garrison, just creating more humans when it attacks gives the Garrison a huge boost too. Something I really like in this deck, which I'll get to when I talk about it. The other equipment that I think is actually really incredible in a deck like this is Stitcher's Graft. If you haven't played much of Draft, you might not know about this card, but it's a 1-mana equipment. It equips for 2, and it gives the equipped creature +3/+3, but it has a couple downsides. Whenever the equipped creature attacks, it doesn't untap during its next untap step, and whenever the Stitcher's Graft becomes unattached from a creature, you have to sacrifice that creature. So these are pretty big downsides. It gives a huge boost for a very small investment, but it essentially locks your creature down, meaning they can't block and they cannot attack again on the following turn. Now there are a couple ways around this. Due to Sigarda's aid, we can actually flash this in after our creature has declared an attack and then attach it. And then the trigger won't happen on Stitcher's Graft, so we'll be able to untap with it and attack once again. Additionally, Stitcher's Graft actually works pretty nicely with Stonehaven Outfitter. It's a little bit of a nombo just on its own. The way Stonehaven Outfitter works is if an equipped creature dies, you draw a card. However, if Stitcher's Graft is the only equipment attached to a creature and you go to unattach it or move it to another creature by paying the equip cost, then you won't actually draw a card since it'll no longer be equipped, and Stonehaven Outfitter will not see the Stitcher's Graft on that creature when you sack it. However, since we're playing 8 equipment, it's not unreasonable that we'll have the ability to have 2 or more equipment on the same creature, and you can actually use the Graft as a way to kill your own creatures, and assuming there's another piece of equipment on them, draw from Stonehaven Outfitter. Like I said, a bit of a non-bo just between the 2 cards, but the potential with additional cards to draw us a bunch of cards. Stitcher's Graft is really nice. It's a huge boost. Kind of the inspiration for this deck was flashing this in with the protect our creatures and also give us a huge swing. Stitcher's Graft is the card that makes our most explosive hands really strong. +3/+3 is not something to scoff at, and like I said, the fact that this can get us around something like Galvanic Bombardment or Fiery Impulse is really nice, while giving us that huge boost on top. Stoneforge Acolyte's kind of a not amazing card, but it's pretty decent in this deck. I will point out that there are in addition to the 2 Acolytes, there are a total of 11 other ally creatures in the deck, so it's not too hard to use Cohort. If you've never seen this card, what it does is it lets you tap itself plus another ally you control. You get to look at the top 4 cards of your library, reveal an equipment among them, put it into your hand, and then throw the rest on the bottom. So this helps us find our pieces of equipment. It's really nice that we can use this on our opponent's turn, and if we have Sigarda's aid, still be able to flash in our equipment, which is really nice. Otherwise, the card's not too crazy on its own. It does have that ally type in, so it does help with Stoneforge Masterwork on a couple of our creatures, but it is a 2-of. Since we're not playing that many equipment, we really want to have equipment in our opening hand, but we will miss some amount of the time, or we'll want to find additional pieces, and this card really helps us dig towards those. The only other 1-drop in the deck is Kaeya, Hero of Akros, and this is definitely the most expensive card in the deck, probably around $10 a piece. It's easily replaceable by pretty much any other 1-mana 2/1. The reason I picked Kaeya instead of, say, Expedition, Envoy, or Dragon Hunter is because of the indestructible ability. It's really easy to suit up a Kaeya with some equipment, make it really big, and then have its own indestructible ability to protect it. It's a really nice creature. It is legendary, and honestly, we don't want to flip it that often, even though the backside of it's not that bad. We just want it as an early game creature that we can start suiting up with some equipment and bashing in there while having that extra protective ability on top of it. Moving on to the 2-drop slot, which is pretty heavy, we have a playset of Weapons Trainers. This is a 3/2. It's human, it's an ally, and it is a soldier, so it works with nearly every other creature in our deck as far as Stoneforge Masterwork goes, and it gives our entire team, minus himself, a +1/+0 boost if we control an equipment. That doesn't stack with multiple equipment, so it maxes out at +1, but they do stack with each other, so dropping multiple Weapons Trainers means another big boost. This turns Stitcher's Graft into +4/+3, which is fantastic. Stoneforge Masterwork will very likely be a +2 or higher with his additional boost. And he's a 3/2 for 2 on his own, so he can trade with things from like Sylvan Advocates, Reflector Mages, so on and so forth. He has the potential to make our team really, really big, and that's why he's a 4 in the deck. There's no doubt that there should be 4 of these, since he synergizes with pretty much the entire deck. Might be one of the most important cards for you to draw to have an explosive start. The other kind of necessary 4 in the deck, I believe, is Stonehaven Outfitter. This is a 2-mana 2/2 core ally Artificer, so it only has that Artificer type in with the Acolyte, but that's fine. The ally, again, does help with Cohort. It helps make Stoneforge Masterwork relevant for a couple other cards like Weapons Trainer and Bushwacker, but the ability here is what's important for this card. Equipped creatures you control get +1/+1, and whenever an equipped creature you control dies, draw a card. The cool thing about the equipment here is that they're usually going to stick around when our creatures die, so we can use Stonehaven Outfitter to repeatedly make up for our creatures dying and hopefully draw into more gas. The +1/+1 is actually pretty big too. Imagine a situation in which you have a turn 1 creature equipped with Stitcher's Graft, and then you have a Weapons Trainer plus a Stonehaven Outfitter. That creature's getting effectively +2/+1 on top of whatever the equipment's getting. So our creatures can get really, really big, and the extra draw here is really important for this deck because it's really the only way for the deck to kind of dig deeper and get more gas out of it, aside from the Acolyte finding us equipment. But it's really, really essential for the deck, and again, I would not even think of cutting one of these in order to play this deck the way I have it. Value's Lieutenant may not be necessary for the deck, but I do think it's very, very strong, particularly with Handwear Garrison. Again, it is important to note that the Outfitters and the Acolytes are not actually humans, and Bushwacker is not human either, but we still have a 14 to 15 count human count. Thalia's Lieutenant comes down, pumps a lot of our creatures. It pumps Weapons Trainer, does not pump Stonehaven Outfitter, and then additionally starts getting additional pumps after that. Very, very strong with Handwear Garrison, which we'll get to in a second, while also making the Garrison a little bit bigger and a little bit harder to kill. But I do think Thalia's Lieutenant is good in the deck. Whether or not it needs to be 4 of, I can definitely debate on. I don't think there needs to be 4 of these. I could easily see myself running only 2, maybe even 1, and replacing the additional copies with more Relicseekers or Acolytes or 1-drops. But that's up to personal preference. I do think the card is quite good, and I've been happy with it playing it. Moving on, there's a 1 of a Relicseeker. The reason there's only 1 is because he kind of fits the same role as the Acolyte, but has a better creature type in for our deck. It is possible to just cut the Acolytes and play more Relicseekers, but I do think the Acolyte coming down on turn 1 is pretty cool. Relicseeker, for those of you who don't know, has Renown 1, which means it gets a 1/1 counter the first time it deals damage to an opponent, and when it becomes Renowned, you can search for an equipment and put it into your hand. So there's a nice search in there. It does have to get through first, but that shouldn't be too hard for this deck. You can make your creatures pretty big and make it easy for them to get through. It is an Origins card, so it will be rotating soon. I try to avoid a lot of Origins cards, but there are some on this list, simply because I'm trying to get most of my decks ready for rotation. But Relicseeker is a nice card. It is a human, but it's not necessary by any means. It's just a decent card if you ever get it in, and it has that little pump on its own, so stitch this up with a Stitcher's Graft, and hopefully it'll get in and find you an equipment, essentially drawing you a card. Incendiary Flow is another new card from Eldritch Moon, and a very good one. It's a sorcery speed lightning bolt that exiles a creature that dies if it was targeted by the flow this turn. It can also go to the face, which is really nice. Sometimes having that reach is really, really good. This is why I prefer Incendiary Flow to something like Fiery Impulse or Galvanic Bombardment. Those cards are cheaper, they are instants, but they only deal with creatures. Having that 3 damage to your opponent can close out some games, which is really, really necessary for this deck. It is possible for a very low curve deck like this to run out of gas very quickly, so having a card that can just kind of finish the deal, seal the deal, is really, really really nice. And I think 3 is a good spot for this. I don't want to run all 4, even though I think the 4th one would be fine. Maybe cut a Thalia's Lieutenant for it. But I think the card is fantastic, and I couldn't see really sideboarding these out against most matches. Maybe against these big creature emerge decks, but against Bant Company, it kills almost everything in the deck, exiles them, gets rid of them, and just, again, has that reach to deal the last bit of damage. The One of Ride Down is a card I really like. Again, not necessary for the deck, but what it does is it blows up a blocker, and then essentially your creature deals damage as though it wasn't blocked, assuming it was only blocked by one creature. It gives your creature trample, but this lets us just mow down whatever's in the way. I could see playing more of these, actually. I think the card's fantastic. It's kind of hard for it to transition from a draft atmosphere to a standard atmosphere. Your opponent's going to wonder why you're attacking into their 3/3 or 4/4 or so on and so forth with your 1/1s and 2/2s, but it shouldn't be too much of a surprise. This can also win a game. If your opponent's in chump block mode, you can knock their chump blocker out of the way and just deal trample damage to win the game. It's good against cards like Kalidas, where the lifelink won't happen because the creature will be dead before Kalidas can hit. It's good against emerge decks, where you've just got these giant creatures that are hard to get through, like Elder Deep Fiend, or people who are playing cards like Distended Mindbender, and so on and so forth. Creatures that just happen to outrank us by the mid to late game if we get there. Ride Down can take care of those pesky blockers and let us still push in a little bit of damage. Like I said, I could see playing more of these, but I wanted a high creature count to kind of mitigate the 8 pieces of equipment we're already playing. We can't afford to play just a ton of spells. Moving on, probably the best card in the deck is Handwear Garrison. Best purely on power. It's a 2/3 for 3. When it attacks, you get 2 1/1 human creature tokens tapped and attack. And yes, we are playing a Handwear Battlements, but we'll get to that in a second. It's not necessary for the deck. It's just there kind of to be cute. This card is insane with Thalia's Lieutenant and Stoneforge Masterwork. If you equip this with Masterwork and then you attack with it, those 2 extra humans give Garrison a boost as well because of the Masterwork. It's pretty incredible with Thalia's Lieutenant because those 2 humans coming in will trigger Thalia's Lieutenant twice, giving him additional counters. And those little tokens are great for Stitcher's Graft or Stoneforge Masterwork in conjunction with Stonehaven Outfitter to give a huge equipment boost, while also being a creature that you're fine getting rid of if you need to draw cards from Outfitter. Not to mention, if you have an equipment on board, Garrison plus the 2 tokens are already getting a boost from Weapons Trainer. So a very versatile card. This is the one that once you play it, you want to protect it the most. So you'll probably shove as much equipment as possible on it. But it's very, very good. And it's a must kill from your opponent. If your opponent doesn't answer this card and you have it on turn 3, you can pretty much ride it to victory in this deck. It does that much damage in the deck we're playing. Bushwackers. This is kind of a pet card. Again, I don't think it's necessary for the deck. It could be replaced by some other human synergy, or something like Abbot of Carol Keep, or something a little more consistent. But it's very, very strong in this deck. It's a 2/1 haste. You can surge it for 2 instead of paying 3, which means if you've already cast a spell during the turn, you can pay 2. You can pay the reduced cost. And when it enters the battlefield, if you surged it, your other creatures get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn. So the ideal situation here is you have 3 or 4 lands, hopefully 4, and you go, Thalia's Lieutenant or Weapons Trainer into a Surge Bushwacker, and you smash your opponent for a lot of damage they may not have been expecting. Same goes if you get up to 5 lanes, you can play Garrison, Surge a Bushwacker, and attack in for a huge amount of damage your opponent may not have been expecting and may not have played around. Bushwacker can really push this deck over the top. It can give it a lot of reach. It can make your creatures strong enough that they can push in a win through a very tight board state. and can help you win a combat. Of course, it doesn't give a toughness boost and it doesn't get its own boost, but it does have haste, and like I said, I just like the card. It's a pet card of mine, not necessary for the deck. Being a goblin is a little bit awkward, but again, it is an ally, so it works with the Acolyte's Cohort ability as well. Last card I'll talk about here is Chandra Fire of Kaladesh. There's a 1-of in the deck. It's not a very expensive card, maybe $3 or $4 at the moment, I believe, so not super pricey. It is a human, so it will work with Thalia's Lieutenant. It works very nicely with Stoneforge Masterwork. Apparently it's a shaman. That's probably my first time noticing that. But I like it in the deck mainly because of its power with Stitcher's Graft. For those of you who haven't seen Chandra in a while, because it's not a particularly popular card, it untaps whenever you cast a red spell, which gets around Stitcher's Graft's downside of not being able to untap the turn it attacks, or the turn after it attacks. Assuming you have a red spell to cast, of course. Stitcher's Graft makes this chick a 5/5, and you can untap it at will with a red spell. That's not very relevant because of her ability. If she deals 3 or more damage during a turn, notice that's combat damage or damage to a creature. It doesn't necessarily have to hit a player. Then you exile her and you flip her, and then you basically get to just start pinging things for 2 damage, whether it's your opponent or other creatures, and then it gets out of control very quickly, can help you close out a game very quickly. But assuming this will almost always flip the turn it attacks, assuming you have some sort of equipment on it. You can use it as just a pinger. It only pings players, and it's not bad doing that, but I think you really want to get this chick flipped, and assuming it's not dealing damage for some reason, it's going to be able to untap very easily and just threaten to be a big swinger on the following turn as well. Again, I like it with Stitcher's Graft, but a lot of times it'll flip anyway, and that, just for those who may be questioning it, the whole exiling and flipping into a Planeswalker thing does circumvent the sacking ability from Stitcher's Graft, so you don't have to worry about that either. Moving on to the land base, we are playing mostly basics, 14 basics total out of our 21 lands. The plains count is higher because we don't have any 1-drops that require red mana, but we do have a 4 to 6, I believe 6 white 1-drops, and we really want to get those down. If we have Sigarda's Aid in our hand at the opener, we want it down as early as possible. We want the Acolyte down. We want Kaeya down. We want to be able to get those cards down easy. Sometimes you'll just be playing equipment on turn 1, and that's fine. But I did decide to up the plains count over the mountains simply for that reason, that we have white 1-drops and we don't have red 1-drops. Handwear Battlements is a 1-of. Again, it's not necessary in the deck. It is there just to be cute. We are playing 4 garrisons, so it is possible that at some point we'll be able to meld them together and completely thrash our opponent from there. It's not very likely, though, since Handwear Battlements has to be the 6th land in addition to the 5 other lands you're tapping, and in a match where you're only playing 21 lands in Standard, it's not very likely you'll get up to that point very often, but it is still an option, and it's still nice to have. Other than that, the other lands we're playing are 2 Needle Spires and 4 Battlefield Forges. These are just to give us more flexibility in our lands. I would love to play 4 man lands in here, but honestly, we don't even want tap lands. Needle Spires is just really strong when it's strong, especially if you can equip it up, but again, you won't get to that point very often, and it's just there for flexibility. Battlefield Forge is probably the best land you want in your opener, since it gives you ultimate flexibility on untapped, and hopefully we can beat our opponent before the paying off of the pain land really gets us. Moving on to the sideboard, I'm playing 3 Lone Riders and 3 Lightning Berserkers, kind of an odd mix. Lone Rider could easily be in the main deck because of how strong it is with Stitcher's Graft and other equipment. I like to board it in against decks where either First Strike is good against X1s, or where I'm going to be racing my opponent and the lifelink matters. It's not hard to flip this guy. All you need is Stitcher's Graft or a Stoneforge Masterwork, or even, Weapons Trainer gets it really close. But I like to board the card in rather than play it, just because it is kind of weak if you're not flipping it reliably. And I don't know. it's skeptical whether I should be playing it in the main board or whether I should be boarding it in or playing it at all. It is the type of card that I think once it flips, it can really overtake a game, especially if it's equipped with something, just a huge first strike lifelink trampler. That's really hard to deal with. Lightning Berserker is a really neat card in this deck. I like to board it in against decks that have a lot of sorcery speed removal and can't deal with the dash on it. The reason I like it is because you can equip it really cheaply with Stitcher's Graft and get around the downside on Stitcher's Graft, since Berserker will bounce back to hand at end of turn. It's kind of weird because you can kind of use Berserker's ability to give him a boost anyway, rather than paying the 2 for an equip cost, but it does give you that extra point of damage if you're paying the 2 to equip a Graft or maybe even a Stoneforge Masterwork. The other place I like Lightning Berserker is alongside Thalia's Lieutenant, as it's a repeatable way to pump your Lieutenant. Assuming you're dashing it in turn after turn for 1 mana, it essentially puts 1 counter on top of your Lieutenant. A couple one-ofs in the deck: Ironclad Slayer, Hidden Dragon Slayer, Abyssinian Missionaries, and Collective Effort. Sorry, in the sideboard, not in the deck. Ironclad Slayer is really only there for people who have equipment removal. Maybe even something like Kolaghan's Command. I don't think there's a lot of actual artifact removal in Standard at the moment, or at least not a lot that people are playing. Kolaghan's Command doesn't even get played that much, but it could come in sideboard to blow us out. Ironclad Slayer would come in against decks that are capable of bringing in Kolaghan's Command, just as a way to kind of help us get back equipment if it gets blown up. Not a very good card on its own, but it does kind of help us mitigate 2-for-1s by getting a piece of equipment back if our opponent has that artifact destruction. Hidden Dragon Slayer is a reprisal on a stick, and it's really there for emerge matchups or matchups where our opponents can just go really big. It does kill Emrakul, which is really nice. Of course, Emrakul's still going to take your turn for you and kind of mess things up, but the fact that you can do this instant speed and it can target Emrakul is a really good way to deal with it. Not to mention you can just run this out as a 2-mana 2/1 human for the synergies that are there. And it has lifelink, which isn't very prevalent in this deck either. Abyssinian Missionaries is a 4-mana card, so I like to keep it in the sideboard. You don't want to go too expensive with the cards in the main deck. But what it is basically just a catch-all answer. If you've watched any of my other deck tech videos, you know I like to play at least one kind of catch-all. It's not too hard to equip this thing, flip it, and if you don't know what it does on the back, when it transforms, you can exile a creature until it leaves the battlefield, and it becomes a 4/4. Really nice with Sigarda's Aid if you can flash in an equipment at end of turn and you can equip it for free to Abyssinian Missionaries. Stitcher's Graft essentially makes this a 7/7 on the back that exiles a creature, which is insane. It's an option to deal with things that I otherwise wouldn't be able to. Collective Effort, again, is there for big creature decks while also having that enchantment removal on it in case there's something that's really getting in our way. Can't think of too many enchantments that we care about too much, but it is an option. There is this Starfield of Nyx decks that is actually pretty cool, and this can really blow that up. Plus, it has the 1/1 counter on your party ability, which is really nice in a deck like this. I like it in the sideboard too. The double white's a little annoying. And the Escalate cost requires us to tap creatures down, which is not what we want to be doing with our creatures, but it's a decent card to board in certain matchups, and you'll definitely like having it if you play this deck. Collective Defiance could easily be a main board card, but I didn't want to bog the deck down with too many 3-drops, so it's in the sideboard. Doesn't really do anything different than Incendiary Flow as far as this deck's concerned, but that extra 3 to the face on top of 4 to a creature is pretty nice. If my opponent's playing a lot of 4 toughness creatures like Kalidas or something along those lines, I could see myself boarding this in. It's nice that this deals with a couple creatures that Collective Effort doesn't, so they often come in together, but it's a very flexible card. It just didn't feel right in the main board when I was playing it, so I took it to the sideboard. Final card is Repel the Abominable. Also a card you might not be familiar with outside of draft. It's 1 and a white for an instant that says prevent all damage that would be dealt by non-human sources this turn. And it's really neat that it's worded that way because it stops cards like Radiant Flames, it stops Chandra's minus ability, and stops Nahiri's Wrath from dealing any damage. They're not human sources, so it stops them from dealing any damage for the turn. Doesn't stop Languish or any removal, but you can use this to kind of counteract a Fiery Impulse or counteract a Collective Defiance. Kind of like Dramoka's Command's ability to prevent damage from a source as well. This does it as well. There aren't actually a lot of humans floating around outside of human-based decks, maybe Reflector Mage and a couple others, but you can also just board this in decks where you feel like you might need a fog. It's good against like the vampire decks, which often come down to can you trade with enough vampires to stabilize, and this can definitely win you a combat since most of our creatures are humans. Keep in mind that some of them aren't. So, for instance, the core creatures or the Bushwacker will actually have their damage prevented if you use this at the wrong time. But that's why it's in the sideboard, is against very specific cards like Chandra and board wipes and things of that nature. A couple alternatives I consider for the deck. Nahiri didn't seem right for the deck. She is good, and we are red-white, and maybe it's a disservice to play red-white without playing such a powerful card. I just didn't see how she contributed very much to the deck. We're not doing very much with the discard, even though Luden is pretty decent as is, and the -2 ability is okay. At most, I'd probably put her in the sideboard, but I don't like putting the 4-mana card in the main deck of this deck. She doesn't really synergize with the deck either, and the -8 is borderline irrelevant. Not really fetching us up anything crazy if we even get to that point. Dragon Hunter is kind of like the representative of all the other human deck cards. I could have easily put Knight of the White Orchid here or Expedition Envoy. Just these early game 2 ones. I feel like if you're playing a critical mass of those, you're probably better off just playing like a white or white-green human deck, which already exists, so you can look up other deck techs for that. I really wanted to focus on the equipment in this deck, so I left out a lot of these 1-drop creatures. Glare and Aegis and Pacifism are pretty nice alongside Sigarda's aid, since the aid also lets you flash in auras. Being able to flash in a Pacifism seems decent, and being able to flash in Glare and Aegis is actually a lot more powerful than it looks, letting you tap down a creature and give your creature a big enough boost to survive something like Grasp of Darkness or so on and so forth. I just think it's enough worse than Stitcher's Graft on the power boost that we didn't really need to play it in this deck at all. There are plenty of other auras you can consider for the deck, but these are just kind of like poster child auras that would be low enough to fit in such an aggressive deck while also having a pretty significant effect. Then finally, a couple of other equipment. There are a lot of equipment floating around, but a lot of them aren't particularly great. Bonesaw could go in this deck. It's just not a very good card. The +1 boost is a little unexciting. The only reason you would play Bonesaw is either A, you feel like you're not going to hit enough equipment, so you put in a 9th plus equipment in the deck, or B, you really need to surge something out by playing a 0-mana spell. The first, I think we've got covered. With 8 equipment, you're almost always guaranteed to hit one in your opening hand, and the Acolytes kind of help search for more. And B, we're only surging in Bushwhackers, and we can probably do that without a 0-mana spell anyway, so Bonesaw is not necessary. And finally, Sword of the Animus is actually a pretty strong piece of equipment. It only gives +1/+1, but it lets us filter out lands when we attack. We don't want to draw lands, so getting more of them out of our deck is pretty decent. It's just not a significant of enough boost for me to justify playing it. It's also legendary, so playing multiples doesn't really do anything for us. Could easily be a one-of in the deck, and I wouldn't be surprised to see people would really like the way it turns out. Finally, what are we good against? What are we bad against? I feel like we're pretty good against other human decks or other really aggressive decks like vampires. We can make a really, really big attacker really quick, and one that's resilient to damage. That's why I also have Grasp of Darkness here, is because we really get around these minus abilities or these damaging abilities. I've mentioned Galvanic Bombardment, Fiery Impulse. Even 3-4 damaging spells don't really do anything when we have Stitcher's Graft on a creature. Almost every creature in our deck is 2 toughness or more, so once we put Stitcher's Graft on it, it becomes a 5 toughness or higher, making it pushing it right out of the range of Grasp of Darkness. Our opponent's often going to have to 2-for-1 themselves in order to clear off one of our creatures. Also, I put Liliana on here, not just because Liliana is pretty poor against our deck. It doesn't kill anything except for Kytheon, and that's an unequipped Kytheon. But Planeswalkers in general will probably have a hard time dealing with this deck, since we can make really big blockers to get through. Nissa might be an exception, or something like Gideon that can make a token every turn, but we can go wider than that, I believe, and get in a lot of damage. And also, Ride Down helps us take out whatever's chumping us and take the Planeswalker down. What we're weak against is unconditional removal. Exile effects in general, like Anguished Unmaken, Declaration in Stone, Murder, even Ultimate Price kills everything in our deck. These type of cards are much more versatile in what they hit. They're usually a little bit more expensive or a little harder to cast, which is fine, but they will get us. They'll often 1-for-1 us and work the way removal is supposed to work. Big creatures are really hard for us to deal with, especially emerge creatures and cards like Ishkana. That's why I'm playing the Ride Down, and that's why I have sideboard options against them. In the first game, I think we just want to be smashing in as much as possible, and then we want to kind of shape our deck depending on what we played against in the sideboard. But cards like this can really present a roadblock for us. Thankfully, we do have the tools in the main board to get over them. It's just going to be a little bit of a struggle to get there. And then finally, I already mentioned it, but Kolaghan's Command especially is pretty bad, or pretty hard for us to deal with, since it blows up one of our equipments, and in addition probably kills a creature or shocks us or makes us discard, so on and so forth. Not a lot of artifact destruction comes to mind when I think of Standard at the moment, but anybody who has that kind of option in their sideboard, or especially Kolaghan's Command, has a little bit of an edge on us post-sideboard. So I hope you guys like the deck. Sorry for the stops, sorry for the stuttering, but I get really excited about these decks. Anyway, just kind of leaving you here with kind of like the busted draw. If you have a turn 1 Kytheon, you can follow up with a turn 2 Sigarda's Aid, and then Stitcher's Graft, equip for free, and bash for 5 on turn 2. Obviously, your Kytheon will untap, but a 5-4 on turn 2 is nothing to scoff at, even if it can only attack every other turn. Just think about that. You can do some really busted things, and one of the things I really like about this deck is there's flexibility. You can take out the cards you don't like and substitute them for maybe some more humans, maybe some more allies, maybe different types of equipment you really like. Anyway, this is just me throwing my idea out there, throwing a deck that I've liked out there, so feel free to remove pieces, add pieces, do whatever you want with the deck. Anyway, I would really appreciate any likes, comments, and subscribes you can leave, especially those comments. If you have any suggestions, or if you really like the deck, or you really hate the deck, you think it's dumb, let me know, leave a comment, and we can have a talk about it. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. My name is Timothy, and I will see you guys next time.